Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. And you can support me on Locals, Subscribestar, and buy me a coffee. And also, Substack. So, while we're waiting for some people to come in, today's episode can sort of be seen as a supplement to my episode from last week, Towards a New American Consciousness, where I sort of outlined some early ideas that I've been working on, which I'll flesh out more in future about what this might look like. And this specifically is focused on the 13 years from the Texan independence to the end of the Mexican-American War, because in part, a lot of this idea that I'm working with, that America has an ideal, a consciousness, that a set of ideas that begins in the 13 colonies and develops over time, is, going through this, quote, heroic age at the Alamo, San Jacinto, and, ultimately the March on Mexico City by Winfield Scott. So this idea that, and this is, so America's, got a lot of wind in its sails right after the War of 1812, beating Britain for the second time. And we're sort of seeing what these new principles look like and in the new nation, and why they've become under attack in recent years. And so, as a sort of preamble, those are the reasons why I think this is important. And also, of course, growing up, I got all the good stories about the Alamo and Santa Anna being the big baddie of the West. And that also, is why I chose this period of time, because I remember growing up reading history for the first time. This was an exciting and interesting period of history. One of the common threads of discourse over the last 30 years has been a deconstructionist attitude towards U.S. history, coming not only from the usual sources of the far left, but even ostensibly professional historians. The rise of Texas and the Mexican-American War in this 13-year period is often a target for such deconstructionist narratives. While it is, of course, true that the broader westward expansion of slavery did govern elements of this history, coupled with manifest destiny, ultimately Texas was brought into the United States via annexation in 1854. It would be overly crude to see this conflict solely in these terms. While certain northern opposition to the Mexican War was rooted in objections to the extension of slavery, the spinning of this narrative into white racist southern planters invading Mexico as illegal immigrants and then seceding from Mexico to join the forces with the U.S. to annex half of Mexico in the War of Expansion is unmerited. The problems with this narrative are many, but let's start with the real reason this is problematic. The true reason for this critique has nothing to do with the actual historical events, but rather ideological reasons. As I have recently stated, if we look at the history of the United States from Jamestown down until, depending on your pick for the major point of divergence, 1861, the U.S. Civil War, 1898, the Spanish-American War, 1913, the formation of the Federal Reserve Bank, the U.S. took a radically different path towards empire, dominion, and globalism that was a direct repudiation of the earlier principles of the Republic. For example, John Quincy Adams stated, "But she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. She will recommend the general cause by the countenance of her voice and the benignant sympathy of her example. She well knows that by once enlisting under other banners than her own, where even the banners of foreign independence, she should involve herself beyond the power of extrication in all the wars of interest and intrigue, of individual avarice, envy, and ambition, which assume the colors and usurp the standard of freedom. The fundamental maxims of her policy would insensibly change from liberty to force. The frontlet upon her brow would no longer beam with the ineffable splendor of freedom and independence, but in its stead would soon be substituted an imperial diadem, flashing in false and tarnished luster the murky radiance of dominion and power. She might become the dictatress of the world. She would no longer be the ruler of her own spirit." As we see in our own day, the United States has indeed lost her own spirit. These values of self-reliance, suspicion of distant centralized authorities, such as the state, religion, and business interests, problem-solving, courage against all odds, and much more are ideals that directly threaten entrenched power structures. The very entrenched power structures that make up the three pillars of the U.S. empire: the priest class of technicians, the warrior caste of the military-industrial complex, and the managerial class of the politicians. This broader leftist and historical attack on the historical elements of the early republic are not born out of principle, but an attempt to attack these ideas by attacking the men that held them. In Moby Dick, Captain Ahab says, "Hark ye yet again, the little lower layer. All visible objects, man, are but a pasteboard masks. But in each event, in the living act, the undoubted deed, there some unknown but still reasoning thing puts forth the moldings of its features from behind the unreasoning mask. If man will strike through the mask, how can the prisoner reach outside except by thrusting through the wall? To me, the white whale is that wall and shoved near to me. The white whale serves as a mask for God, and Ahab, in his effort to strike at God, he strikes at God's mask. Of course, being spirit, God is not such a thing that can be attacked in this way. Ideas, also being immaterial, cannot be attacked in this way. While historians and pundits attack the men who held such ideals, they cannot, in so doing, attack the ideals themselves. They exist in a realm that is unable to be touched by human hand. Furthermore, it is not like even the old optimistic U.S. historians didn't realize many of the Texians at the Alamo were rogues, filibusters, rakes, and rascals. That was never whitewashed. The real question is, did the ideas of Travis, Bowie, and Crockett represent ideas that would last and were superior to those of the Mexicans? The question more or less answers itself. The other reason I believe these attacks are based in an atavistic desire to stab at the mask worn by American principles is compared to what? Let's look at David Crockett. If the ideals of men like him were compared to contemporaries, such as the First American Republic, or the ideas of the Caudillo like Santa Anna or the Comanche, do any of these alternatives offer something better? I would say no. When one looks at a nation, one needs to see it as a living organism that grows in the time dimension, especially if that nation has strong principles at its inception. There will be ideas it literally cannot even conceive of that centuries later will be seen as obvious. Leftists who criticize the Alamo holdouts are standing on nearly 200 years of history founded on ideas they stood for. It is kind of a grandfather paradox. Can you still have the ideas you hold if you metaphorically kill the founders? The answer is no. The secular effort to root Christian ethics in something other than Christianity has failed spectacularly. The modern critics of the Texians or Polk do not have alternatives. What should they have done? They usually make appeals to ideas, concepts, and technologies that did not exist in the 1830s or 40s and show their insincerity. I fully admit that there are moral truths that determine right and wrong at all ages, but in a developing philosophy and national consciousness, a consistent application of said principles is often not always apparent until much later, through no fault of anyone. The idea that Texas, along with the original 13 colonies, were an experiment in something new, a new world can be found in David Crockett, and has stated reasons for going to Texas. In a letter to Charles Schultz, dated December 25th, 1834, he says this: "The time has come that man is expected to be transferable and as negotiable as a promissory note of hand. In those days of glory and Jackson and Reform and Co., like Van Setts in his chair, and as sly as a red fox, and I have no doubt he thinks Andrew Jackson has full power to transfer the people of these United States at his will," which is referring to the expulsion of the Cherokee from Georgia. "And I am truly afraid that a majority of the free citizens of these United States will submit to it and say, 'Amen, Jackson done it.' It is right if we judge by the past, we can make no other calculations. I have almost given up the ship is lost. I have gone so far as to declare that if Martin Van Buren is elected, that I will leave the United States, for I will never live under his kingdom. Before I will submit to his government, I will go to the wilds of Texas. I will consider the government a paradise to what this will be. In fact, at the time, our Republican government has dwindled almost into insignificancy. Our boasted land of liberty has almost bowed to the yoke of bondage." If you continue reading the letter, he also criticizes the slave power of the Old South, which he views the Jacksonians as representing. So we see with Crockett his idea is that, well, Texas is still fresh and new. There's still a chance to do something different and better. Now, he's probably the most noble-minded of all the Alamo heroes, because he is doing this based on principles. And he did stake his professional political career in defending the Cherokee land rights in Georgia. We already see his opposition to the relocation of the Cherokee Indians under Jackson, which Van Buren is continuing. Later in this letter, he criticizes the rising power of the slaveholding class in the South. Here we see that Crockett was trying to live out what he saw as the best elements of the U.S. spirit in Texas. We also see the tension between ideals and realities when a nation is growing over time. After considering the mental and ideological issues with this line of critique, let us look at the complex history, especially in light of geopolitical analysis. Both pro-Texian and anti-Texian accounts tend to ignore broader events going on in Mexico in 1835, 1836, and beyond. Santa Anna had, by 1834, established a military junta under his control, abolishing the liberal constitution of 1824, which enshrined federalism with his own version, centralism, which was a tightly controlled state at the top with a powerful leader at the top. This would remove regional rights from the Mexican states. Not only did Santa Anna have a revolt in Texas on his hands, but also revolts in the Yucatan, Zacatecas, Coahuila, Nuevo Leon, and Tamaulipas. Mexico is literally coming apart at the seams. The original Texian revolt needs to be seen in this light, and in the early days, Texians did not think of themselves as fighting to leave Mexico, but as seeking to restore the 1824 Constitution. Stephen Austin spent much of his life defending Texian rights within the framework of the 1824 Constitution. At the Battle of Gonzales on October the 2nd, 1835, John Henry Moore saw the Mexican general Castaneda as fighting for Santa Anna against the Federalist cause. Even the early Texian government, the consultation, did not initially support independence for Mexico, including Stephen Austin. Texian independence, therefore, must be seen within the broader context of a Mexico-wide civil war between the Federalists, who supported the 1824 Constitution, and the Centralists of Santa Anna, who were seeking to set up a military state. Santa Anna was a ruthless dictator who was not afraid to kill prisoners of war and civilians in cold blood. In addition to his well-known massacres at the Alamo and Goliad, less well-known is his brutal repression of Federalist loyalists in Zacatecas and the sack of their major city, Zacatecas. Santa Anna is about as clear-cut a bad guy as you can get. He was hated in Mexico and forced to leave the country twice, each time after military defeats, first with the Texians and second with the United States. Santa Anna represented the worst elements of the old world of brutal application of force, tyrannical rule, and imperialism. The modern leftists take this guy's side over the Texians of the U.S. shows how bankrupt they are. A little-known fact is the Yucatan separatists in 1847 sought admission into the U.S., but the annexation bill failed to pass the U.S. Senate. We can see this is a battle of ideologies in the two men of Santa Anna and David Crockett. The former represents the corruption, militarism, brutality, and savagery of the worst elements of the old world. And the latter represents the new spirit of self-government, freedom of speech and thought, and a more humane system of laws. And again, to emphasize this point again, David Crockett, in his professional career as a politician, did defend the land rights of the Cherokee. So, I mean, this is kind of unusual at the time. Most of his peers did not do that. For example, the Tejanos, Mexicans living in Texas, supported Texas independence in the final analysis. To say that the new Texas government, or later U.S. state, did not give them the full rights it gave to Anglo settlers misses the point. How many rights would the Tejanos have had under a centralist regime under Santa Anna? Far less. In the end, I think they gained in the exchange, especially looking at Texas and Mexico today. Even if we admit that many Texians were rascal slave owners and more, they carried the values of the best elements of old Europe to the New World that Santa Anna, the ineffectual Federalists, and the Comanche were not going to build upon. One major sticking point is the suspicious historical reporting of the tension that led up to the Mexican-American War. When James K. Polk sends Seth Thornton into the region between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande River as a show of force and is then attacked by Anastasio Torreon, becoming the Thornton Affair, Polk later uses this incident as a casus belli for war with Mexico, stating, quote, "The cup of forbearance has been exhausted even before the recent information from the frontier of the Del Norte, but now, after reiterating menaces, reiterated menaces. Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon American soil. She has proclaimed that hostilities have commenced and that the two nations are now at war. Close quote. Many historians and individuals of Polk's time, such as Senator Abraham Lincoln, viewed this as a contrived ruse to get America into war with Mexico. Mexico claimed the northern border of Mexico was the Nueces River, while Texas and later the U.S. claimed it was the Rio Grande. What is never mentioned in this game is the Treaty of Velasco. After Santa Anna was captured in the Battle of San Jacinto, Sam Houston resisted calls to execute the man on the grounds that Santa Anna could ransom his life for the recognition of Texas. Santa Anna then signed the Treaty of Velasco, which in Article 3 states, the Mexican troops will evacuate the territory of Texas, passing to the other side of the Rio Grande del Norte. Thus, clearly, the southern border of Texas is set at the Rio Grande by the then acting head of state in Mexico, Santa Anna. The problem then arises that the Mexican government changed again. With Santa Anna and Texian in custody, President Jose Justo Coro claimed Santa Anna had no power or right to sign such a treaty. Nevertheless, the Mexican forces withdrew from Texas. Santa Anna was not allowed to return to Mexico until 1837. In 1838, Mexico fought a short and sharp war with France called the Pastry War. Furthermore, in 1840, there was a separatist movement known as the Republic of the Rio Grande, comprising the Mexican states of Coahuila, Nuevo Leon, and Tamaulipas. There was also the still ongoing separatist movement in the Yucatan. From a geopolitical and even a political situation, Mexico was a failed state. It did not have a coherent political leadership identity, with coups, revolutions, secessionist movements, and civil wars racking the nation. The Texians, or U.S., never knew who they were making a deal with, and if the next government would accept the terms of the last treaty. Based on the Treaty of Velasco, I believe the legal right to the disputed territory between the Nueces and the Rio Grande was the U.S. Well, first Texas and then the U.S. with annexation. Even if later governments rejected Santa Anna's treaty, they lacked even the power to control their own nation. Mexican forces withdrew after the treaty was signed, so the reality on the ground, despite the wishes of certain politicians in Mexico, had lost the region. It was bad faith to continue stirring up tensions over this region. With the U.S. concerns of European colonialism in Latin Americas and the Monroe Doctrine, we see a very legitimate fear that Mexico might fall, say, to France. France had already invaded in 1838, and in 1861, France did invade Mexico in a serious attempt to conquer it. With this in mind, the United States has a massive security risk to its southern border, a failed state with armed factions. This threat lasted until the 20th century with the famous raid by Pancho Villa in 1916 into Columbus, New Mexico, and the potential for a European nation to form a base of operations for future actions in the New World that would threaten the U.S., as France did in fact try to do in 1861. With this in mind, Polk can be seen as operating as a rational geopolitical actor who was trying to secure the U.S. southern border. Furthermore, since the time of Cortez down to 1846, the Mexican states that would become the U.S. states of California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah were never really settled or developed. In fact, the initial large settlement of Texas began at the end of the Spanish rule in 1821 when they invited Anglo settlers in to develop it. They were largely indefensible, as both the Spanish and Mexicans yielded to Comanche raids. Mexico was not in a position to secure these regions. The entire geopolitical situation constituted a crisis for the U.S., and Polk is acting on geopolitical instincts. In conclusion, the real reasons modern historians attack the heroic age of the American frontier is that they are trying to kill an idea by attacking an imperfect manifestation of that idea. Process that is doomed to fail. Texas and the U.S. represented a values quantum leap over Spain and Mexico that, in time, would produce better results. In many respects, as a new nation with a new set of principles, it was an inevitability that it would fail to express these values all at once. So, that is most of it for now. To further contextualize this for anybody who hasn't seen my video from last week, my idea is that the basic principles of the United States, as outlined in the U.S. Constitution, earlier in the 13 colonies, there was always that tension between that and the countervailing forces of ultimately the financial interests. That was defeated by the Andrew Jackson initially in 1836 and 7 when he waged war against the National Bank. But then, of course, it came into the back door in 1913 with the Federal Reserve. And, long story short, you could say that the real pivot to overseas expansionism begins with the Spanish-American War. I also did a video on a speech, later turned into an essay given by William Graham Sumner called The Conquest of the United States by Spain, where he talks about how this is a huge turnaround for the Americans from their general principles. And I was like, well, kind of looked like for most of my life that this was over, that we weren't going to go back to these principles. But with the new Trump-Musk government, maybe we will. I mentioned a couple of weeks, by this point, 3 or 4 weeks ago, I saw a tweet from Musk where he's favorably retweeting Ron Paul, saying we should just leave people alone and not be the world's policeman. So then I started to think about the idea of a biospirit, a civilization that grows and develops over time. Certainly ideas do. And then from there, we go into the idea, okay, well, from our vantage point, looking back 200 years later, obviously, sure, there's going to be elements that we know better than either the original settlers in the 13 colonies or the founding fathers or the settlers on the frontier. But the thing is, some of these ideas they could not have possibly known, because it's only by building on their legacy that we know them. So a lot of these disingenuous critiques from modern people is, well, they just couldn't have known. This is ridiculous. We know now because we've built on their heritage. And if instead Mexico or Spain or some other European power had maintained control, we wouldn't be in this vantage point to even make the critique. It'd be the grandfather paradox. You've killed the foundation for your idea. And also couple that with, I think it was about a month ago, I did the roundtable on capital punishment with Keith Preston and Florian. The idea being that even amongst, the hardliners like the Puritans, burning at the stake and all sorts of execution measures, in old Europe just weren't done. I mean, in England, it was horrible. You could be drawn and quartered. You could be disemboweled. You could be burned at the stake. A lot of different ways that you could die that were brutal. So we have the cruel and unusual punishment clause in the Constitution. And yeah, I mean, there's still lynchings and there were still tarring and featherings, but, over time, though, that limits itself. It becomes reduced. And so what I think is happening is that the United States, the early English settlers created a kind of like cultural, spiritual machine that's like self-adapting. So I think in that case, this self-adapting system over time is working to align the country, the nation, with the principles that it espouses. So, that's interesting right there. So, and there's a lot more to tease out. This is sort of just the very beginnings of a new set of ideas that I've been working with. But let's see who's in the chat here. We have Imperator Forge, Cyber Ninja Zero, and Corbin. Hello, and Hashima One. Hello. Let's see. Imperator Forge. Many would consider this to be the first period of alleged imperialism. Yeah. Now, there's a distinction that I remember hearing from Pat Buchanan in his Republic, Not an Empire, that said it was 1898 that America finally became a quote, true empire by having its overseas possessions. And at first, I was not convinced because I thought, well, isn't westward expansion just the same thing? And this is just being redirected now to outside of North America. But I think there is a very important difference, and that is the ruling over subject populations. So the Spanish-American War, the debate was, well, as if anybody who heard me read Sumner's essay, was, well, how can you have these American principles of self-government and liberty and then have a military occupation of the Philippines and then not have that have some fundamental contradiction with your values? Because what needs to be understood is that most of the lower 48 was practically empty of human population because diseases initially brought by the Spanish had decimated native populations. So if we look at the world in 1492, these are Stone Age peoples. Upper limit for the lower 48, Canada and Alaska might be 4 million. And that's really generous because Mexico had 10 million. Now they were an agrarian urban society. So yeah, they could have that. It could be as low as 2 million. 90% were killed by Spanish diseases before the English even showed up. English settlers who landed in New England and Virginia commented on all of these, decimated villages. So by the time you get to the 1830s, we're talking maybe 100,000 people, over that vast landmass. And then, even the Mexicans weren't really populating their part north of the Rio. So it looks like that, that contradiction, like with the Philippines, didn't exist yet because it largely was empty. Obviously there were claimants to the land that other European powers, Mexico, Native Americans, but the actual, like, for lack of a better word, human biomass just wasn't there. And so you could see this as just an organism growing into an empty space, more or less. Whereas, conquering the Philippines and fighting the world wars and occupying countries to contain the Eastern Bloc, it's been a complete different situation. And furthermore, depending on how you want to look at this, I think you could argue it's not likely or probable that the 1913 shift with the bank, when we have this financial interest, and then we had the war interest beginning with World War I, none of that happened during the westward expansion. In fact, after the second bank was defeated by Jackson, the same basic principles of the American system continued more or less unabated. What really did in the American system was the formation of large corporate cartels using, I think it's the 13th Amendment, to define themselves as legal persons so that they could just, in legal terms, in the Middle Ages, English law had a concept called the immortal person. And the only institution that was an immortal person was the Catholic Church. And so people didn't like selling when property was sold to the Catholic Church because since it never died, it didn't go back into circulation, like if you sold it to a human being. But this concept of the immortal person just proliferated with corporations, and they just took over. That's what I think did in the Republic. And Jackson did the right thing in setting up these financial interests back in the 1830s. So that's what I'd say about that. Let's see. Imperative Force says, I think the Yankees and Brahmas were focused on sea expansion and the Southerners and Appalachian people on land expansion. Well, the New Englanders were interested in naval trade. They weren't really interested in annexation of foreign territory. In fact, in the War of 1812, they were not really supportive of the American cause at all. In fact, I don't think Massachusetts even raised its militias. And that led to the fall of the the political party, the Whig. No, the Whigs came afterwards. The descendants of the Washington's party. So, all right, yeah, that's all we got for tonight. So, it's Todd Lewis, the Praise of Five podcast, signing off.